when it comes to the local church, I don't think we should think of diversity in terms of quota, meaning 20% of this, 15% of that. I think what it really should help us to think is, what does meaningful belonging look like regardless of the composition of your church? So if you have 2% that is a minority group, like, ask the question, what does meaningful belonging really mean to them?
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Word Made Digital podcast. Thanks for checking out the video version of the podcast here on YouTube. Of course, we've got the audio version as well if you want to check that out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. But we really hope that these conversations week after week inspire you, connect with you, maybe stir something up in you or teach you something that you haven't heard before. We've got a whole archive of podcasts right here on the YouTube channel, as well as a ton of tutorials to equip you really practically as a communicator, as a leader in the church, and as a creative. So I encourage you to check that out. Subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much to the sponsors, Compassion Canada and the Church Go, for making this season of the podcast possible. Daniel Yang, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really glad to have you on the podcast today.
Joanna, I'm so honored that you've got me on, and I miss my time in Toronto being neighbors with you. So,
well, I'm back in that neighborhood where we met.
Yeah.
People are going to listen to a little inside chat here for a second. I'm in Regent Park again. I've moved back to this neighborhood just in the last few months because I bought a condo here years ago, and it took a few years for them to build it. So now I'm in that home that they built. But yeah, we met in Regent Park when you were church planting. So maybe just as a bridge into, can you give a little introduction of who you are? I know you as Daniel, who church planted in Toronto, all the way from America to Toronto.
Yep.
But I'd love you to just introduce yourself a bit, and then we'll dive into a conversation. We want to talk about church planting. I want to talk about this post-COVID world. I want to talk about multiculturalism in the church, what the minority churches can teach the majority churches, all that kind of stuff. So
Awesome.
Before we go too far, who are you, Daniel?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm the one that I think burned your clutch on your Mini Cooper. So real quick funny story for your listeners. So you and I were at a concert together. We arrived there separately, and you did this funny thing. You rolled your ankle. I'm trying to remember.
I broke my ankle.
Broke your ankle.
Yeah. At the concert. Yeah.
And so you asked me to drive your Mini Cooper home, and it had been a while since I drove a stick. And I'm pretty sure I burnt your clutch.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I just remember being so glad someone could drive my car because it was a manual transmission, and
Right.
I had now a broken ankle. You need 2 feet to drive that kind of car, and I had no way to drive it. So I ended up I traded cars with someone for
Oh, did you?
I had to trade cars with someone for a few months. So maybe they noticed what you'd done, but
Maybe
no,
they noticed it. Yeah, no, it was definitely, it had been a while since I'd driven a manual, but yeah, thanks for having me on. And I do miss Toronto, so we'll get to that part of my journey as well. But I currently direct what's called the SEND Institute at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. It's a partnership between the North American Mission Board and Wheaton College here. And really what I do for my day-to-day is I work with those who plant churches, specifically leaders of organizations, and we think about the future together. So we're a think tank for church planting, and I just help leaders think more strategically about how to better plant churches, especially given kind of the changing demographics and some of the cultural shifts that we're seeing, not just happening over the last few decades, but I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it, even what we've seen over the last few years. And so that's what I've been doing for about 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was, like we said, I was in Toronto planting a church in downtown. And that church is still amazing going, and just was with Mike Seaman last week. And he continues to lead that church. Ethnically, I'm Hmong. And so I grew up in inner city Detroit. And so even though I'm an American, I lived like 30 minutes across the border from Windsor. And so I may have even snuck across the border a couple of times to do things that 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds aren't allowed to do in the U.S. But
there's a few more things. There's a few more things these days with that's not saying that 18-year-old
Canada's
Daniel
a little
would have
bit more,
participated, but a little bit more easygoing on those
that's
things.
right. But I grew up inner city, an inner city kid, predominantly African American neighborhood. Children of refugee immigrants, and so a child of refugee immigrants, and so that was my upbringing. And I'll fast forward, but I eventually moved to Dallas-Fort Worth, and I was an engineer for about 9 years. Eventually came on staff at a large, predominantly Anglo-white megachurch in Dallas-Fort Worth. And I'm so thankful for my time, but that was the first time I'd ever really immersed myself in a predominantly white community. And, I joke with folks, like I was never afraid walking down an alley in inner city Detroit. But when I got to the affluent suburbs of Texas, I was like deathly terrified because I had never really had a lot of connections with affluent white people. And so that was the demographic that I identified the least with. And kind of in God's, providence, that was where I spent 3 years. And I have an amazing friends. My mentor, one of my spiritual fathers, I just got off the phone with him. He still he was the pastor of that church that invited me on staff. And they were the ones that sent us to Toronto. And we planted that church in downtown Toronto. So that's kind of our journey in a nutshell, my journey in a nutshell. And just really thankful to be on with you on this episode.
Well, yeah, and Daniel, as we were saying before we hit the record, we tried to get you on last season, but you went through like a major health thing, and so we're glad you're with us for many reasons. Glad you're with us today, but glad that you're with us in general, that God's plans for you and His hand in your life has meant that you're still here and you're healthy, and, there's so much you have to offer, so we're so glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joanna. I mean, you're referring to, I had open heart surgery back in May of 2021. And I don't think it was something that I really understood the weight of what I was actually going through until, I had the surgery, and it dawned on me like this was going to change my life. So just so your listeners know, I had a quadruple bypass, and I'm 41. So there's a lot of, like questions that I have because I was so young. But I will say this, that whenever you have a major life-altering event like open heart surgery, where literally I could have died. It makes you think about like what's important, and it does make you think about like how do you focus on what's right. And when it comes to like things like church, and when it comes to things like the future of Christianity in North America, like it makes you realize that we put up with a lot of like a lot of fluff, and God in His sovereignty is actually like shaking things up. So that the things, this is Hebrews chapter 12, like 26, 27, so that the things that aren't supposed to remain would fall off. And that's happened in my life. And I think what's happened in my life is kind of like a parable of what's happening in the church in North America. There's a lot of things shaking up right now. And the things that are falling off are supposed to fall off because they cannot remain forever. And that verse goes on to say that only God's kingdom is unshakable, and because God's like this consuming fire. And He's doing that in my life, and I think in some ways that's parallel to what He's doing in the Church of North America.
Well, we have like a broad sense, probably the people listening to and learning with you today have a broad sense that church has changed pretty radically post-COVID. I talk about, a lot of us talk about like the speed of the change, especially I like to talk about technology and digital things and all that. So on that front, for example, a lot of churches went through like a decade worth of technology upgrade in 2 weeks. Like everyone had to figure out how to go on the internet at once in grand experiment, and people fumbled along the way and have figured out some way to meet when they couldn't meet in person. But also this grand story of the COVID reevaluation of what people's priorities were, what was working for them, what's not working for them. Do you have any, as Ascend Institute, any insight or like is there numbers, data, insight? What is actually going on right now in the church?
Yeah, you make a really good point, and we actually did quite a bit of like a number of surveys early on last year to try to understand how churches were adjusting, and I can kind of give some big shapes around that in just a bit. But I want to come back to a point that you made that I think is real important, that the pandemic in some ways fast forwarded some changes that were already taking place. The digital piece, you're spot on. I think for those churches that were waiting to do ministry digitally, they were forced to really do that. There's an article by Ross Douthat from the New York Times, and it's called, he entitles it Waking Up in 2030. And essentially his argument is that the pandemic really fast forwarded us 10 years in a lot of ways, not just in technology. But I think technology is a big thing, because something that we're going to have to consider now moving forward, as churches will probably not get back to this less digital, like we'll only become more digital. But the medium is also now a part of the message, and I think those are things that we're going to continue to reimagine. So how do you reimagine church attendance around digital participation? And we're not just talking about streaming a service, but we're talking about churches that are entirely trying to figure out how to do meaningful community through a digital first strategy. And so that's a trend that I think was already happening, because there were already digital churches that were being innovated prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic really gave legitimacy to those who are trying that. As a matter of fact, I was at a group with Exponential Ventures 2 months ago in Nashville, and it was amazing to see the number of churches that felt validated because they had already developed digital online communities. I met with a church planter he started a gaming community. And I'm not talking about 3-4 guys that like to play video games and then do Bible study afterwards. And we're talking about the world of Discord and the world of streaming gaming and just hundreds of people who feel like this online community is their church. And so they play games, but then they also do Bible studies and accountability, and they have found ways to provide accountability and mentorship and discipleship. And, probably prior to the pandemic, stuff like that would have been looked at as that's a weird oddity, but that's become increasingly acceptable, and not just acceptable, but almost hey, maybe this is how we reach a certain segment of those who are previously unreached through our traditional means of evangelism and being the church. So I think it definitely has given way to that. I think it fast forwarded that. And then I think what we've seen, it's hard to give sweeping trends, because the South is a lot different from Canada. So what's happening in the South, in Texas, where there's almost no pandemic, or at least they like to pretend there's no pandemic, is so different than what's happening in Alberta, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that for those churches who want to get back to normal, and I would say there's probably about a third of churches from the early surveys that we did that they were waiting out the pandemic to get back to normal. There's about a third of churches that were really trying to innovate, and then there were about a third of churches that were just kind of they were trying to improve, but they weren't necessarily trying to innovate. They were just tweaking. And then there was a third that they were just kind of you know what, we're just gonna wait this out. And I think what you're going to discover is that those who are innovating are actually going to probably uncover new ways to do community, new ways to do content delivery, whether that's a sermon. I know a church actually in Toronto where they've said, you know what, we're actually going to do a digital first delivery in terms of sermons. And then all of that, and this is not different necessarily from the multi-site video venues, but it's different in the sense that now it's an equipping video type that then either the small groups or the house churches, whatever the different venues are, will use not as curriculum, but use as actually their platform to begin to think about missionally, how should they engage in the cities and the places around them. And I think that level of innovation is going to pull the church towards the future. I think my gut instinct, though, is, Joanna, there is going to be a large number of churches that are hoping that this would get back to normal, and especially if giving doesn't go down. So for those churches who feel like giving is stable, even though they don't have full attendance in their worship gatherings, I think there's less pressure for them to innovate. It's those who really feel like, you know what, if we don't really figure this out, we may not exist in 5 years. Those are the ones that I feel like are really innovating. And lastly, I'll just kind of give you kind of two big ideas. Those things are primarily around how do you decentralize, and so decentralizing ministry, but also decentralize decision making. And then the other is around not just not digital per se, but how do you create delivery platforms that can be accessible by as many people as possible? And obviously, digital platforms are going to be part of that.
Right. I guess I'm curious about, there's so many threads to pull on there, but I'm thinking about this in the context of church planting, which is focused through the sending of people to do new things. And maybe this is partly a conversation around a global church perspective, which, Daniel, I know you have. I'm trying to have from my own experiences living all over the world. In a lot of countries of the world, pastors aren't professionals. They, a lot of countries, even wealthy countries, I spent time in France. Most of the pastors in the French church were not paid, or if they were paid, it was bivocational. They had another job 9 to 5, and they got a bit of a salary from the church on the side. But the church didn't have the means to give them a huge salary. It was largely volunteer-based boards making decisions, so everything was slow to change. Are you seeing that come? Is that one of your sort of predictors of what's coming next as we're planting and building the church of 2030? Will we see less kind of quote unquote professional Christians?
There is. So let's talk about it historically, and then we'll kind of try to predict the future. Although I'll say I'm not a prophet. I work for a nonprofit. I don't make a lot of profit. So, but we can kind of try to peek and see. But historically, let's just talk about North America, for instance. The two largest Protestant denominations, so outside of Catholicism, are the Southern Baptists. They would be the largest Protestant group in North America. And then the Methodists would be the second largest. In comparison to the Presbyterians, the Congregationalists, which really, they don't exist anymore. They became Unitarians, a lot of them. And then, the Anglican Church, which was the Episcopalian Church here in the U.S., and it's still the Anglican Church in Canada, and then reinvented about 14 years ago here in the U.S. So if you compare all those that had more professional, clergy, priestly class, even the Lutherans, they tended to see slower developments in terms of the number of churches being started. And it kind of makes sense because credentialing tends to be a bottleneck. But then the Methodists, really early on, they were actually the fastest growing movement for a long time until the Baptists began to kind of overcome them in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And eventually in the 60s, I believe, the Southern Baptists became the largest Protestant denomination. But when you look at that, the Southern Baptists, they eventually overcame the Methodists because the Methodists began to create a lot of ordination tracts for their pastors, whereas the Baptists still had very much a bivocational model of ministry and church planting. Essentially, almost anybody could plant churches. You didn't need to have certain, this comes from the priesthood of all believers, a theological position that thinks that we all have direct access to God, and therefore we can, read Scripture for ourselves and then also do missions for ourselves. So that was a big part of the Baptist polity, and I think that what you're hinting at, what we're seeing all over the world, even here in the U.S. today, the only denomination that I know of that is growing year after year is the Assemblies of God. Here in the U.S., it would be equivalent to PAOC in Canada. And by and large, it's because they have a lot of bivocational pastors. So I think we've always seen the growth of the church tied to less professionalism. I think what we should ask ourselves is if we maintain a professional class, and when I say professional, it's like, air quotes, double air quotes, professional. We have to ask the question, why? So why do we need those who are paid vocational? And I really believe something that Hugh Halter, who's written a lot on missional leadership and bivocationalism and missional movements, he said this. He says that there's nothing wrong being vocationally employed, but if you're just doing ministry, that's not enough reason to receive a paycheck. He says you're probably vocationally employed because you're actually equipping people and coaching people to do ministry. And I think that to me is really where we should reevaluate how we understand paid vocational ministry, because everybody should be doing ministry. But if you're being employed or if you're receiving, some form of payment for it, it should be because you're actually an equipper and you're helping others to do the same. And so I think in some ways that's the reality. As you kind of project that into the future, there's a movement right now that's not just bivocational, but you may have heard of the term co-vocational, which essentially embraces the fact that there are a lot of people that feel called that both their secular, quote unquote, secular vocation is just as aligned with any pastor's ministry vocation. And so they have a co-vocational calling both to their secular job, but also to, the kingdom of God. And I think that movement is steady and it's strong. And I know, I know folks who are doing, why am I having a absent mind? CrossFit gyms where they're planting churches in CrossFit gyms. We all know the coffee shop church, right? I mean, that's been happening for about 20 years. But CrossFit gyms, so we're seeing these different models of co-vocational ministry. And I think we need more of that just as much as we need more traditional churches. And
it makes me think, too, of, I often even myself, having worked for churches, I've been a pastor, I have worked in sort of ministry roles professionally now for a long time. And now in what I'm doing now, I'm helping lots of churches, coming alongside them with sort of a more narrowed expertise. I hope I can bring the best parts of me, and they don't have to pay me for all the worst parts of me. But there's this thing bubbling up that has caught on, I think, to a lot of people's ears through things like Mars Hill, the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. I don't know if you've listened to any of it,
sure.
but
Yep.
But just the idea of people are using the words deconstruction and all this kind of stuff, but this idea that, and then we've seen the implosion of so many, especially male, but just leaders in the church. Usually those are men, with some sort of implosion, and people are sort of saying, "Hold on, this system that we built with this paid guy at the front who is sort of it makes me often think of what God said to the Israelites when they wanted a king. Like, we want a king to be like everybody else. Everybody else has a king. We want to be like them. And God says, but don't you know what's going to happen if you get a king? Here's the things that are going to happen. And like, oh yeah, he's going to like tax you and stuff too. And so all this negative stuff comes with we wanted a leader to look and feel like everybody else around us. And now it feels like in the church, the Mars Hill podcast is one of those examples to me. People are reevaluating, do we want this kind of a church? So I'd love to hear from you, Daniel. What are some, you've mentioned it maybe already in a few different ways, like the CrossFit thing, but what are some models? There's no perfect model, but what are some models you're seeing gain some traction right now? If this mega church, we want a king thing, people are saying, hold on, we realize a lot of that was pretty messed up. what are some things you're seeing rise up now, especially post-COVID,
Sure.
that's working or that we have maybe some hopefulness in? Because I think people feel really discouraged. Give us some hope, Daniel.
Yeah. They should be hopeful. We all should be hopeful. We should also be sobered by the realities of the shaking up, the Hebrews 12 passage that I was talking about, because I do think that this is God's doing. Let me come back to the megachurch thing, though, because I think it's going to be an easy target for a lot of people to dismiss like large churches, and then to dismiss strong leaders, I share the concern. This is me saying that there is a form and a version of the megachurch that I think is expiring. And when I say that, I'm not saying the megachurch should or is going to go away, but I think we might say the CEO model, use whatever metaphor, and that version of church leader, I think we're starting to see the power of that and the allure of that, wane. And for a good end, I think in some ways, human beings weren't made to have that much influence. Very few are, and that's part of the reason why we haven't had mega churches for a long, long time. Up until, as a matter of fact, in the U.S. there's about 1,800 mega churches, but that's a fairly new thing. Mega churches, 2,000 people or more. Canada, I think Canada might have maybe 100. I'm not quite sure the numbers in Canada. But United States has about 1,800. And prior to, I think, the 80s, the number of large churches, more than 2,000, they were in, a very small number of them. And so because I do think that there is, if you trace the development of organizational theory, and I would link a lot of what megachurches are to organizational theory, although there were churches like Moody Church in downtown Chicago, Spurgeon's Church, and there were some churches that were large that weren't built around organizational theory. But I'd say most modern churches adapted organizational theory, things that we learned from the business world, we learned from academics, we learned from the military even. A lot of these organizational structures we took into and now apply them on a day-to-day basis without even knowing their origins, not in a malicious way by any means, but in a very convenient way to develop the systems and the processes in which we run large churches. And I think in some ways, if we don't reinvestigate and reevaluate, again, like the motivation behind that, then we'll see an expiring paradigm of not just the megachurch, but the leadership criteria that's needed to run a large church. And so I think that is going to come under evaluation. That's why we have the podcast, and that's why there's a bit of I'll be honest, there's a reckoning in some ways of this style of leadership. But I don't. My message isn't to sound that alarm to cause people to be suspicious about the church in general. I think, as somebody who is, an insider to the evangelical church, not like I have special knowledge, but as somebody who's inside, evangelicalism, I think that these are things that we should fully embrace and know that Jesus is doing that. There are some models that I do think that are proving to be helpful in terms of like providing better levels of community for others. And so one of them would be the network of microchurches or missional communities, whatever you want to call them. But there used to be, a movement of house churches. You don't hear about house churches as much anymore. But the version that we got here in North America was kind of very anti-institutional, anti-megachurch. So people started planting churches in their homes. And for many people, that is a very meaningful experience. I would say kind of the iteration beyond that is we are seeing emerge really robust networks of microchurches that are networked together for a common cause, but then have very much autonomous leadership. And these churches can be anywhere between 12 to 30 people, sometimes even up to 60 people, but they belong to a larger structure that has accountability. And I don't think that's a silver bullet, but that's like another iteration over the last 15 years we see become a sustainable model of church. And probably one of the ones that we might be most familiar with is Tampa Underground, but there's a lot of versions of that. And then, something that I'm really encouraged about, Joanna, is I have a friend of mine. Her name is Hannah Gronowski. She's here in Chicagoland area.
Yeah, I know her.
And yeah,
she's a friend of mine as well.
Great. She's just tons of energy.
Yeah, she makes me feel old.
And what she's starting isn't so much a church, but she's providing pathways for younger people to have safe spaces to, number one, process their own questions in their church experiences, if they do have a church experience. But then to discover, a pathway for, what has God developed me for, and how do I intersect that with some of our greatest needs in our world today. And what I like about that is, in some ways, it starts with process. It starts with guidance, and the form kind of comes a little bit later, And I'm really interested in seeing a lot of that happen. And that's not because I no longer believe in the forms of church that we have today. I just really believe that there are new forms of church that could be discovered. And so to me, what I'm trying to look for when I'm thinking about the future is, what are the platforms that are being, when I say platform, not like front stage platform, but when I say platform, think like Airbnb, Etsy, Uber, kind of these that really become a place where people can come and create with proper guidance, with proper coaching, with proper accountability, but they're able to create and innovate. To me, I think if we can push into that, I think by the time we get to 2030, 2040, we'll see disciple-making movements like we're seeing around the world that will eventually emerge into new expressions of churches.
And so I think it's an interesting transition in the conversation for me to talk about some issues of multiculturalism, multi-ethnic churches, the new wave of immigration of Christians from around the world coming to North America. I want to talk about all that, but one of my worries, I think, when in my experiences of observing house church models, is a lot of them become very tribal very quickly, as in it's a 3 families of white people who are all in their mid-30s and are frustrated with their mega church. Now they hang out on Sundays and have brunch at home and talk about Jesus and pray a little or something. Meaning, like, you're just hanging out with the friends you already had. I mean, what I like about, almost always in my life, I've been part of very large churches. And it's sort of like my mother tongue is being in these large communities, but it's like the language and culture I know best. However, what I like about some of that is that it does force you to be with people of different ages, different, socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, etc. Where what I see often happening in my own experience anyways of a lot of house church movements is it's just a bunch of people who look and think about, they have the same complaints about their local church, and they have kids that are all the same age, and they have a similar financial background. So how do we do that better? If that's maybe the move, I'd love your perspective on that. And, as a move into this whole conversation we need to have around, and multiculturalism maybe isn't even the right word to use, but I'd love to move us towards there, and your observations on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll give you my thoughts around like the initial iterations of house church and what I'm seeing come out of like certain emerging networks of microchurches. There was a sense in which the house churches of like the 80s and 90s were somewhat of a backlash to institutional, large churches. And so it was a very like deconstructive thing. I think that has a different spirit than some of these other movements that I'm seeing, that diversity may not be represented within the group of 12 people, but it's represented across the network that brings the micro churches, missional communities, house churches. So let's say, for instance, in Tampa Underground, they're an easy example because they're one where a lot of people can easily understand what they're doing. And they would say they're not doing it perfectly, and I think they would also say that they're entering into a new season. So, but they're highly innovative, so I don't think they're afraid of change. But they will have a micro church that is very focused on mentoring and providing identity for inner city African American girls. And the leadership team of that micro church has a very specific assignment, and they exist in some ways to be a discipleship resource for young African American girls who are looking for identity. But they exist in an ecosystem, and so they don't exist by themselves. And so the leaders will interact with other groups that work with different demographics, and as a network, they're very diverse across the network. But in their individual works, they might not be, and they find ways to mesh, and they find ways to work together. But I think that to me is a very different field than what you had described, where some people are reactionary against large church and they just want to be in a safe space. I don't perceive like movements like Tampa Underground is trying to create safe spaces for homogeneity, but they will embrace or they will engage specific demographics, because strategically, if you're going to give identity to young African American girls, then that's a very specific cause. But speaking to the larger issue of what's the composition of the demographics of North America? U.S. is going to be a little bit different than Canada, but the U.S. Specifically by the year 2040, and it probably will happen sooner than that, will for the first time be a no majority, will have no majority race. So that means that whites will be less than 50% for the first time by the year 2040. This comes from a guy named this comes from the U.S. Census, but the guy who talks about this probably the best and the most of your listeners are interested is a guy named William Frey. He wrote a book called Diversity Explosion. He was actually my sociology professor at the University of Michigan. And he's the leading demographer at Brookings Institute. And he talks about how if if organizations aren't preparing themselves for this reality, by the time 2040 hits, it'll be somewhat too late. And to kind of like bring that into the church, what he's saying, what I don't think he's saying is that you will not have homogenous churches. I don't think he's saying that. But I think what he's saying is that if you have not thought through the implications of what diversity is going to mean in all segments and domains of society, then your model or your understanding of yourselves will continue to that'll expire. And so, for instance, we're almost to a generation now where young people don't notice diversity until they walk into a room and there isn't diversity, right? And so that is increasingly becoming...
That's an interesting way to say it, yeah.
Yeah, because my kids don't talk about multi-ethnicity and multiracialism, multiculturalism the same way, because to them it's much more implicit and a given than the generations before, That doesn't mean that like they shouldn't learn the nuances and all those things, but it means that like it's becoming more and more of a reality. Whereas I think for a certain generation, and maybe let me just put the cutoff age group at 42. I don't know your age, Joanna, but I'm 41.
Under 42.
And
yeah.
Oh, you are. So 43. Yeah. Okay. 43.
No. I'm 35.
Okay. You're safe. Yeah. Oh, you're really safe then. I'm saying those who are 42 and above.
There we go.
Because I'm 41. Their mentality is still by and large a boomer and Xer mentality, which was birthed in, if you think about when the boomers, in the 50s and 60s predominantly, and the Xers are going to be in the, late 60s and 70s. Like the United States by 1980 was still 85% white in 1980. And so all of our institutions and organizations were formed, whether or not they, realize it or not, they were formed during a time when America, and probably Canada as well, was still largely white, right? And I say it this way: Rick Warren, when he planted Saddleback Church, was an amazing church, and I consider Rick Warren an amazing pioneer. He started his church in 1980, and America was still 85% white at that time. And we're talking about 2040, which is how long from now? Like 18 years? Less than that? Or maybe 19 years? And where you're going to have whites that are 49%, And so these realities are happening really fast. Phrase book, Diversity Explosion, gives a lot of implications for how to understand what that means, how to lead your organization. And I think when it comes to, I'll end with this, when it comes to the local church, I don't think we should think of diversity in terms of quota, meaning 20% of this, 15% of that. I think what it really should help us to think is, what does meaningful belonging look like regardless of the composition of your church? So if you have 2% that is a minority group, like, ask the question, what does meaningful belonging really mean to them? And I wrote an article. I can send it, and if you want to, you can post it. But there are, I think, 4 ethnic meaningful belonging markers that we need to look out for. One is, how do you become a theological community given the different composition of the different groups? Number 2 is, how do you actually make decisions better based on the diversity of the group? And number 3 is, how do you help? How does the gospel help regulate ethnic pride? And then number 4 is, how do you help people through the gospel put away some of their ethnic preferences, not hide their ethnic identity, but to put aside some of their ethnic preferences to show unity towards the gospel. And I think these are dynamics that we used to think only urban churches had to wrestle with this, but it's more and more all churches are having to think about this.
Well, and I appreciate what you say about a generation coming up where they notice when it isn't diverse. Like, you're not going to, you notice when every picture speaking at an event, the faces of all the people speaking at the event, it's all a bunch of white guys, or you show everyone's with the microphone in the room, or the people of power above you in a workplace. They look the same. You notice it then, but you don't think about it when it's different. Even just watching, I was looking this weekend at the Instagram and TikTok stories of, a guy who was like 18 years old in my church community, and we have connections through his family, and so I'm it's not weird. I'm looking at his social media. He's at a football game. He's posting these pictures, and it was just this very ethnically diverse group of people all hanging out together. And I was just thinking about how, because I'm like a marketer, I'm thinking these photos look like they were set up by a marketing company to position multiculturalism. And for him, it's just his friends. Like, they're all just hanging out at the football game. And it's his normal life. So I appreciate, Daniel, what you're saying about that. But you're talking about thinking through how to not make it tokenism, how to not have it just check off some percentages. I think a lot of my experience in churches, predominant white churches, has been we talk about multiculturalism, but what we mean is we want multi-ethnic churches. I mean, we want people of different skin colors and backgrounds, but we actually want them to look, act, sing, sound, dance, praise God, pray. We want it to look like we look, like a white person. So we want them for the token. So, I mean, when you say the thing about the, the shifting the 49% by 2040, white people will be no longer majority in America. I don't know what the stats are in Canada on that. I don't know what year that will happen here. But for those who are afraid when they hear that, and maybe they hate to admit that that sounds scary to them because it's all they've ever known is being a majority. Can you give a pastoral word to people about the change that's coming? How we can be less afraid?
Yeah. I really appreciate that question because at least here in America, I feel like we went through 2 years of purposeful stirring up of fear around diversity and immigrants and all that. I think my most hopeful word that I want to provide is that, number one, God knows the narrative of all groups of people, even the families and the heritage of those who would trace themselves back to the Confederacy. Let's say we're speaking to kind of those who have a Confederate background, and that's probably not a large number of people, but even that, like, God knows your heritage and God knows the things to preserve, the things not to preserve. When we look at the reality of something like immigration, in the United States, 1 out of 4 people that come to the United States are already Christian. This is like such a really well-known, documented phenomena. Like even sociologist Stephen Warner, who's a sociologist at the University of Chicago, he says that immigration is not the de-Christianization of America, but it is the de-Europeanization of Christianity. And what's happening in the U.S. is that we're becoming more aligned with global Christianity. And although that may feel like a little bit of some of us feel like we're losing influence or losing ground, overall, that actually positions the church in America to look more like the global church, because that's really what's happening. And to me, like, the good news is, hey, you're not alone. Like, God is sending Christians, and I literally know. Sometimes I'll tell a joke, like back in the early 20th centuries, white people would sit in a room and they'd draw out a whiteboard, and this is how we're going to reach Africa and India and Latin America. Like, I literally know Indians and Asians and Latin Americans that sit in a room with the whiteboard and they ask themselves, how do we reach white people? And so they're returning the favor in a sense.
Yes.
And I think in some ways, like, that is, it should be a welcome thing, and not everybody that's coming and immigrating. And again, Canada has a recent per capita, Canada has accepted more immigrants than the U.S., especially over the last administration. And that's going to change the composition. It already is changing the composition of Canadian government. And I think in some ways, for those of us who understand the New Testament church, Christians have always been best when we were at the margins, when we had to subversively influence. If we mistakenly thought that Christians were the majority and we wielded power politically and socially, I think Jesus is making clear again for us that you actually do better at the margins, and in some ways, I think that is a good thing. When Christians, because of our sinful nature, when we become the majority, and that's not to say that I don't want to see Christianity, grow, because obviously we want to see more people come to know Jesus. But if we think that we have the majority cultural power, we often tend to make decisions that marginalize others and that benefit ourselves. And so I think, what's happening is that there's not a rebalancing of power, but there's a reawakening that, hey, you know what? It doesn't matter what our skin color is. We've actually been better as a church when we're at the margins and we're speaking prophetically from the margins.
I mean, you wrote a whole book on this that's coming out in 2022, Inalienable, How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church. Do you want to speak a little bit about the book? I mean, you're basically talking about it now, but do you want to say anything more about the book?
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate the mention. We just finished writing the last final draft of it. So Eric Costanzo, who's a pastor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Matt Sorens, who's my neighbor and also the church mobilizer for World Relief. We've enjoyed really struggling with these themes and topics, and a big part of our research for the book is to really understand how the world has arrived here. We used to, many people have this saying that, the world is coming, the nations are coming here so that we can reach them. But they forget that, no, the nations are coming here also so they can reach you. And so there's a part of that dynamic that we're trying to highlight as well. And then, so the global voice, women, we write our social location as we're male evangelicals, and we really are saying that we have missed so much in the American church specifically because we have marginalized women as leaders and as voices. And then, the poor. I had mentioned, how Christians often work best from the margins. I'm reminded of Rene Padilla, who just passed away as a missiologist from Latin America. And he writes about the Galilean option, or the Galilean Jesus. And to be Galilean in Jesus' time meant that you were podunk. You were a podunk person, that you didn't. This was not Jerusalem, Jesus. This was, from the outskirts,
backwater with a funny accent.
Yeah, exactly. This is where all the but interestingly enough, this is where all the uprisings against the Roman government came from, was from the outskirts. They were not the urban, citizens. And Jesus came from that, and that's where many of his disciples in Capernaum, they were fishermen. That's where a lot of them. That was their social location, and I think that speaks volumes about where not necessarily social location, but in our own self, humbling. Christians need to remind ourselves that when we're weak, that's when we're the most usable by God, and seeing the poor and the marginalized, that's a great reminder for us that that's all of us. And then how do we leverage and steward, our resources in a way that's equitable to others? So, we struggled with it because it's a big topic, but I'm really excited about just how God might use that, because I think it's the right time for us to start talking about these things, not just at a very high level, but at an organizational level. What does this mean for our church? What does this mean for our academic institution? What does this mean for our network? Because if we don't do the work now, we'll be far behind by the time 2040, 2050 hits.
This is a last question. When you're thinking of the character or the qualities you're looking for in a church planter in 2022, what are, and maybe you can say it by the opposite. These are things we're not looking for this. But when you think this is the, when the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few, and people listening saying, is it me? Is this something I need to do? What are some of the things that you're looking for? Both literally at the Send Institute, what are some of those characteristics?
Sure.
That you want to see and say, this is the kind of man, this is the kind of woman we think could really make a go at this? Yeah.
That's a great question, a good way to end our time. So I'll give two categories to kind of juxtapose each one of them. So the ones that are tended to be examined or assessed right now in the church planting world tends to be around organizational leadership and entrepreneurialism, which I still think are valuable. So things like vision casting, leading a team, administration, preaching or communication, to use a broader term. These tend to be the characteristics of a capable church planter, and then you can kind of whittle the list down to about 8. And that basically, we're describing a really good organizational leader that can communicate pretty decently. And I wouldn't say that we need to do away with that list, because I think there's a lot of that list that I think, that's true across the board for any kind of startup situation. There's some things that I think we can de-emphasize. I think we have overly emphasized like great preaching. That's probably something that like to me, I believe in shared teaching. So if you're the primary leader, you don't need to be a great teacher if other people can teach on your team. But let me juxtapose that to another list that I think is emerging. Resilience. That's a huge theme. As a matter of fact, in the midst of the pandemic, I think we've already seen a lot of pastors resign, but I think we're learning that there's a cultural upheaval that's happening, that resilient leaders are going to be the ones that last. Empathy. I think empathy is going to be huge. It is huge, but I think empathy is, we have often dismissed empathy as being overly pastoral or being overly, concerned with people's emotions. And it has less to do with that. I think empathy has more to do with the ability to read people and read situations and to appropriately apply either the right words or the right strategy. That, to me, is high-level empathy, and I think that's completely needed. Or else you have this top-down leadership where you're putting Saul's armor on everybody, and I think that style of leadership is going to expire. And then the third thing is what we talked about just in the last 5 minutes is somebody who's culturally intelligent. They don't have to be like the most apt and culturally savvy person, but their ability to grow in their intelligence of cultures, I think that's going to be a big indicator of whether somebody can successfully lead a new church into the future.
Well, Daniel, you're leaving me prayerful, I must say. If people listening are paying attention, these are the things we're praying for in the people building our churches, the people who are maybe us listening and have to go do this and feel convicted, or the people we're going to be led by. These are some of the characteristics we're looking for as God is doing a new thing in a new way in the same old place. Here anyways, at home. Daniel, thank you so much. If people want to find you or find some of the work you've referenced, you're an academic, so there's lots of articles and reading. And where do you want to send people today to find you or find more of what you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to send, sendinstitute.org, and you can see some of our resources, research, and articles that we put out. And then if you want to hear my daily musings, you can catch me on Twitter, at KOOBXWM. And
what does that stand for?
That's actually my Hmong name.
Oh, wow.
And it's not a phonetic spelling, but Hmong people, we do use a Romanized alphabet system that was developed by Catholic French priests in the 50s, actually. And so, although it's Roman letters, like you wouldn't pronounce it the way that it reads. So it's actually pronounced Gongsu, but that's what I use for my social media.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, thanks so much for your work, your time,
thanks for having me.
Your thoughtfulness around these issues. I'm really grateful that people like you are leading and a voice, trying to help us change and do it in an empathetic and gentle way. So thanks so much, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.